As more concrete details of the bipartisan Senate border bill have been released, which illuminated a curious divide within the Republican Party between the small handful that occasionally want to govern and the vast majority that never want to govern and simply play politics, the lead Republican architect of this very conservative deal made the rounds on right-wing media to defend it, to debunk MAGA talking points, and to even put Donald Trump in his place. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert buttons before you go. I'd greatly appreciate it. All right, friends, we have several clips to play in this video, but again, just to remind you of the context, right now, the economy is doing objectively well and consumer sentiment is starting to reflect it, which means Republicans need a new wedge issue to use against President Biden and the Democrats ahead of the election. So now they're leaning into immigration pretty hard because whether we like it or not, it polls very high among Republicans and Americans, and Republicans have a huge polling perception advantage on it. But Senate Democrats and Senate Republicans have been working for months in good faith to come up with some sort of border bill. And it's pretty conservative, all things considered. I mean, progressives and liberals, those of us on the left, actually have plenty of reason to object with the particulars of the bill. And yet, Senate Democrats and President Biden have said, listen, if this passes the Senate, makes it to the House, we'll sign it into law. But now MAGA Republicans are pulling away, saying, no, we want no part of it, because they know if this passes, it robs Donald Trump of a messaging issue ahead of the election, because they certainly can't compete on his record or on the record of Republicans in general over the past few years. So it's truly a matter. Do you want to govern or play politics? And Republicans almost always err on politics. With that in mind, James Lankford, the lead Republican architect of this bill, he's making the rounds trying to save it, and he's up against right-wing media talking points as well. So we're going to play some of the clips and unpack it together.
Here's what Speaker Johnson said. I have seen enough. This bill is even worse than we expected. It won't come close to any of the border catastrophe the president has created. As the lead Democrat negotiator proclaimed, under this legislation, the border never closes. If this bill reaches the House, it will be dead on arrival. Your thoughts?
Yeah, unfortunately, he would step out and be able to say that right away before, obviously, he had had a chance to be able to read it as well and to be able to go through it. The key aspect of this, again, is are we as Republicans going to have press conferences and complain the border's bad and then intentionally leave it open? After the worst month in American history in December, now we've got to actually determine, are we going to just complain about things, or are we going to actually address and to change as many things as we can? If we have the shot, and it's amazing to me, if I go back 2 months ago and say we had the shot under a Democrat president to dramatically increase detention beds, deportation flights, lock down the border, to be able to change the asylum laws, right, to be able to accelerate the process, no one would have believed it. And now no one actually wants to be able to fix it and says, I don't want to even debate it. I don't want to discuss it. We have to decide as Republicans, what are we going to actually do about the border? Leave it open or actually leave it closed?
I think that's a great point by Lankford. I'm just surprised at his naivete. Like, he doesn't even recognize what his party is. His party is not an effective governing party. They're simply an obstructionist, finger-pointing party. Again, if politics is a three-legged race, the Republican Party simply drops to the ground and hugs the leg of the Democrats and tries to bite it as we stagger towards the finish line. That's what we're dealing with. That's his party in a nutshell. Just to give you, before we play the next clip, some top-line notes about this bill. So it's about $118 billion, $60 billion to support Ukraine against Russia's invasion, $14 billion in security assistance for Israel, $2.4 billion to support U.S. Central Command operations and combat expenditures related to conflict in the Red Sea, $10 billion in humanitarian assistance to provide food, water, shelter, medical care, and other essential services to civilians in Gaza, the West Bank, Ukraine, $4.8 billion to support key regional partners in the Indo-Pacific and to deter aggression by the Chinese government, which is basically to help protect Taiwan. $2.3 billion to continue support for Ukrainians displaced by Russia's invasion. And of course, the bipartisan border policy changes. Okay, so again, with very few exceptions, this is a pretty Republican-friendly favored bill, right? At least on paper. There's a Fox News reporter who covers the issues at the southern border. Bill Milligan, I think is how you pronounce his name. And he had a big breakdown. It was pretty favorable towards this bill. He's like, listen, there's no amnesty / legalization of anyone already in the U.S. illegally. Again, this is his analysis of the border bill. It funds an increase in ICE detention capacity to approximately 50,000 from the current 34,000. a 7-day rolling average of 5,000 encounters per day or 8,500 encounters in a single day. And then DHS is required to shut the border down and turn away anyone who crosses. No new asylum claims will be allowed, and anybody crossing will be removed. It strengthens and it makes much stricter asylum claims, right? So again, super conservative, relatively speaking. This is a layup for them. If, of course, they were interested in governance, which, of course, they're not. So in this next clip, James Lankford provides a very crucial fact check for MAGA Republicans and Trump cultists and people who have simply forgotten the reality of the border under Donald Trump.
I would also remind folks during the Trump administration, we also had days of more than 4,000 people that were illegally crossing the border under the Trump administration in 2019, and they were struggling because there's gaps and loopholes in the law.
So when MAGA Republicans and Donald Trump and Trump cultists say that, under Donald Trump, there were nothing going on the border. It was perfect. It was perfectly secure. They're lying to you. They're just simply lying, and they're hoping that you will have forgotten the issues at the southern border. Now, listen, if you want to say that contacts at the border are much higher now than they were under Trump, if you want to complain about aspects of President Biden's border policy, fine, feel free. But don't pretend that Donald Trump had it under control. He did not. He shut down the government in 2019 because he needed additional support from Congress that he felt that he wasn't getting, because it wasn't enough to simply try to govern through executive order, because he faced many legal challenges and lost many legal challenges in higher courts and the Supreme Court. So anyone who tells you otherwise is lying to your face. So with that in mind, I want to play another clip from James Lankford in which he calls out Utah Republican Senator Mike Lee, who is atrocious, for doing what Mike Johnson did and complaining about this bipartisan, relatively conservative border bill, and sandbagging Lankford in the process.
Senator Mike Lee said, not only does he say he needs 3 weeks to read through it, he said no self-respecting senator should agree to vote on a 370-page bill this week. Any 41 senators can prevent the bill from proceeding. If you agree that senators should have this bill for at least a few weeks, and certainly more than a few days before voting on it, say so. You understand where he's coming from, right? Don't you guys have a procedural vote this week? And you're going to vote on the bill by the end of the week?
So we actually have this bill came out yesterday, Sunday. The first procedural vote is Wednesday, and that procedural vote is literally just open it up to be able to go through it and to be able to say, are we going to debate it this week? That's what Senator Lee is actually talking about. It's interesting that he said he's already opposed to it. He needs 3 weeks to be able to read it, but he's already opposed to it. Again, people have got to be able to read it, go through it themselves. Don't just go off a Facebook post somewhere what the bill says. This dramatically changes asylum. It dramatically changes deportations. We no longer have a 10-year backlog. It builds more wall. Those are the key things that it actually does. But read it for
The problem is, as you know, elected Republicans, much like MAGA Republicans, aren't particularly interested in reading, right? Certainly not reading, which would involve legislating, which would involve governing, which would involve more than simply complaining. Last thing I want to show you is a funny comment from Donald Trump. Donald Trump, of course, knows that Lankford is pushing for this bill. This is what Donald Trump had to say about James Lankford, and then we'll fact check the former president.
Well, just to correct the record, I did not endorse Senator Lankford. I didn't do it. He ran, and I did not endorse him.
So Dan Bongino here, I think he used to be on Fox News, at least. I don't know if he still is. He's just nodding along. Yes, sir, Mr. President. Of course, that's true, Mr. President. Except, of course, it's not true. Donald Trump did, in fact, endorse James Lankford. So this is from September 27th, 2022, endorsement of Senator James Lankford. Senator James Lankford ran a strong campaign against highly credible opponents who fought hard but ultimately were unsuccessful. James was strongly committed to America first and everything it stood for, and likewise strongly committed to me as president. Sometimes we didn't exactly agree on everything, but we do now. He's a very good man with a fabulous wife and family, loves the great state of Oklahoma, and is working very hard to save our country from the disaster that it is in. Interestingly, he goes on to say he won Oklahoma. But yeah, Donald Trump actually did officially publicly endorse James Lankford. I'll also point out, he goes, James Lankford is strong on the border. First words of the second paragraph. Folks, this is where we are. MAGA, per usual, is lying to you, and they're banking again on the fact that time has moved on and you have other things to focus on than the day-to-day nitty-gritty of politics. But Donald Trump is a pathological liar, far worse than Joe Biden or any Democrat, and his MAGA cult are also engaging in open lies because they're not interested in solving problems. They want to hurt Biden politically. So again, here's the situation. If the border is a crisis, then that means we need to solve it now. And if you don't want to solve it now with a bipartisan, relatively conservative border bill, then it means it's either not a crisis or you don't care about solving the crisis. There is no third option here. It's one or the other, and Republicans look bad no matter what. They lose on the substance no matter what, but they don't care about the substance because at the end of the day, they're hoping they win the election. Don't let them. Call them out for their hypocrisy. Call them out for their double standards. Call them out for moving the goalpost, and punish them the best way you possibly can, the only way that you will ever get them to change. At the ballot box, they need to lose election after election after election in literally every arena. There is no arena in this country that justifies voting Republican. The Democratic candidate is objectively superior in all of these instances, and punish them. Let them know that as long as they continue to operate in bad faith, they will lose elections and lose power. That's the only language that party understands whatsoever. Let me know what you think in the comments.